Hi, it's Mr. Harold here, and this video is about the required practical for density. So finding the density of solid objects. We're going to be looking at density in general, regular solid objects, and also irregular solid objects too. The equipment that you're going to need, because we're going to do a little bit of interactive work, you'll need a pen, pencil, paper ruler, and a calculator as well for the calculations. So first of all, let me just ask you a quick question. How would you determine the mass and volume of this metal cube? Now you'll notice it is a cube, so it's a regular shape. And what I'd like you to do is just to jot down in a couple of sentences what you would do to find the volume and the mass of that shape. Resume the video once you're finished. Okay, so first of all we have to think about what the density equation is, and that is mass divided by volume. Some of you might remember that mass over volume is the letters m over v, and it looks a little bit like a love heart. So if you remember the term I love density, it's a silly way of helping you remember that formula. And the units for that, so the units of mass tend to be measured in kilograms. In volume it is cubic meters, and therefore density is in kilograms per cubic meter. However, in the lab situation, sometimes those units can be a little bit big, so often mass is measured in grams, volume is measured in cubic centimeters, therefore the density is in grams per cubic centimeter. To find the density of regular objects, it's important to remember what equipment we need and what it's actually used for. So if we think about the metal cube object, that is the object that we're going to find its density of. We need a ruler, so we can measure each length to calculate its volume, which is in cubic centimeters. And we also need a top pan balance to measure the mass of the cube. Please don't be tempted to write scales in an exam, okay, because scales are like a ruler, has a scale on it. We don't tend to use that term. We must use the term top pan balance, or just balance would often do. So which is the equation that we're going to use to calculate density? Obviously it's going to be the first one, density equals mass over volume. To measure an object's mass, what do we use? We use a balance. And to calculate a cuboid's volume, we multiply together the length times the height times the width. Now if you'll notice that term cuboid has been introduced, that's any cube-based object, so it could be a rectangle face or a square face, and then it has a depth to it as well. So how do we go about finding the density of a regular solid object? Well, here is some numbers, some values, and what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to pause the video and I'd like you to find the volume of each object. So again, it's just length times width times height, and then fill in the appropriate column. Then what I'd also like you to do is to calculate the density of the object by dividing the mass by the volume. So this could be very typical of an exam style question where you're given some data and then you're expected to fill in the missing blanks. Now, I know it sounds repetitive and I'm going to ask you to do something which I've just talked about, but I'm going to ask you to pause the video in a moment and do the following. Can you describe the steps required to determine the density of a regular solid? So I've just talked you through that. Can you put pen to paper now and actually write that down? As you're doing it, you will want to think about some points to consider. So what equipment will you use? How will you measure the mass of the object? How will you measure the volume of the object? How will you calculate the density of the object? You have to be specific. 4 marks available. Think about the 4 bullet points that are there. Again, pause the video and resume it when you're done. Now, hopefully you'll have written something similar to what I've got written down here. Again, you can just put this in bullet points, it's absolutely fine. So use a ruler to measure the length, width and height of the block and record the values. In the mark scheme, it often says what are they measuring and what are they using to measure it with. Calculate the volume using volume equals length times width times height. Measure the mass of the block in grams using a digital top pan balance. We don't have to have the word digital in there, but most of them do tend to be that now. And number 4, then use density equals mass divided by volume to calculate the density. Often I've seen written in exams, people then just put measure the mass, determine the volume, and then work out the density, and forget to say the actual equation that you're using. You must state the equation that you're using. Now, on to irregular solids. So it's fairly obvious to see that with irregular solids, we can't measure anything. We can't measure a length, a width, or a height because it varies a lot. So we do something a little bit different for this. We use Eureka cans. So Eureka cans measure the volume of an irregular object. So we fill a Eureka can up with a given volume of water. We then lower the object into the Eureka can, and as the water comes out the spout, we collect that in a measuring cylinder to measure the volume. The volume of water that comes out is equal to the volume of the object that went in. And again, using a top pan balance to measure the mass of the irregular object. So, a couple of questions. What's the unit of density? Obviously, it's grams per cubic centimeters. To measure an irregular object's volume, we use which two objects below? Yes, it's the Eureka can and the measuring cylinder. So, let's have a little look at that. There's some information for you to have a look at. Again, can you use the information provided to calculate the density? Very simple single equation. Okay, and the next task is very, very similar to the one that we've done previously. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause the video to do the following question. Describe the steps required to determine the density of an irregular solid. So again, remember there's a number of points to consider, and they are the same ones as before. So we've got what equipment will you use and how you measure the mass of the object. Both of those can be done in exactly the same way as the previous one. The mass, to determine the mass, we're going to use a balance, and it's the same for whether it's regular or irregular. The different bit that we're going to obviously have is how we find the volume of the object. And again, in this case, we have to talk about the Eureka can, the displacement method, and the measuring cylinder to collect the volume of liquid that's given off when we lower the object into it. And again, you're going to have to state how you determine the density. So again, pause the video and have a go at answering that question, and then resume it once you've got your answer. So hopefully you've got something very similar to what I've got written down. Measure the mass of the object in grams using a balance and record the value. Fill a Eureka can with water until it's full to underneath the spout. 3. Place the measuring cylinder beneath the spout, then place the object in the Eureka can and collect the water that runs off to measure the volume. And finally, use the density equals mass divided by volume to calculate the density. So as long as you've got those 4 bullet points mostly covered, you should be getting full marks for that. Again, another pause the video time to apply what we've done to an exam situation. So again, can you have a go answering the question that's on there? So below is a picture of an irregular solid object. A student wants to find the density of the object. Plan an experiment that would allow the student to determine the density of the object. And again, just pause the video until you have that done. So the response, or what we should have had, was something along the lines. So firstly, density is the mass of the object divided by the volume of the object. Therefore, you measure the mass of the object on the top pan balance. To find the volume of an irregular shape, you get the Eureka can and fill it up with water to the spout. You then get a measuring cylinder and place it under the spout. After that, you place the object in the Eureka can and measure how much water is now in the measuring cylinder to give the volume of the object. You then divide mass by the volume to give the density of the object. So a lot of it is repetitive. It goes over and over again, the same thing, how we find the mass, how we find the volume, and then how we calculate the density. It's the same for most cases. Often the question that's in an exam or GCSE exam that comes up fairly often is you're given a picture of 2 objects, a cuboid shape, so a regular shape, and a statue or an irregular shape, and then you're asked to write a method to determine how you would find the density of both of those objects. So it's just rehashing and going over exactly the same stuff that we've talked about in this video. To be honest, if this kind of question does come up in the GCSE exam, you should be very, very happy because it should be simple, easy, straightforward marks.